Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, photographing the Galapagos, capture mesmerizing wildlife images in the Enchanted Isles, presented by Dr. Court Whelan. Court is NatHab's Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel and has been guiding trips for us since 2013. It's great to have you with us today, Court, and I hand things off to you.
Thanks, Kendall. As always, greetings everyone from lovely Boulder, Colorado. But I gotta say, as winter descends upon us here in the Front Range of Colorado in a few days, I am dreaming of the Galapagos Islands and those tropical shores. I can see a little bit of view of the mountains in the distance here through some trees, and there's fresh snow out there. So winter is coming. But we can dream of Galapagos Islands in the meantime. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Boy, do I love the Galapagos. I will say, as a photographer, it is such a holy grail. At risk of sounding weird by saying this, it might be the best place for the easiest, most incredible photos, because as you'll see in these coming slides with the photos and my explanation, you can get so close to the wildlife. Everything's weird and wacky and interesting. You get great sunlight, great daylight, everything just kind of converges for this wonderful, perfect storm in a good way of making it very doable to get great wildlife photos from the Galapagos Islands. But like all things, there are ways to get better photos than just settling for good or great. Get the best you absolutely can. So this whole presentation is designed around that. Like many of my presentations, most of the lessons you're going to hear about here absolutely apply to other places in the world for wildlife photography, for nature, landscape photography. From your backyard to the mountains here just a few miles away to really anywhere. So a lot of take-home messages, and of course we'll do a nice stint of Q&A at the end. So without further ado, Galapagos Islands, it is the land of birds, fascinating reptiles, and marine mammals. It's a really interesting archipelago. It is, you'll see in a map here just a second, just off the coast of South America, but it couldn't be more different. It's really unlike every other place in the world. And it's not just the wildlife and the scenery. I think what's so special about it is it's really the constant interaction of wildlife with its habitat, species on species interactions, from conspecifics, like same species, from different species. Things are just all in this interesting melting pot, just converging as if you had kind of like a Noah's Ark where you just plucked animals and put them together. And you're like, why is that sea lion next to this tortoise? And why is this iguana hanging out with seagulls? And it's so weird and wacky. It's such a delight, and to capture it is just so fun because it's actually some of the more doable. You don't have the traditional challenges of crazy low light like in the Bornean rainforest. You don't have the challenges of fleeting quick glimpses of wildlife like you might have in other places of the world. It's really fascinating. So like I always do, especially with new areas that I'm talking about, is let's go a quick little primer on what the Galapagos Islands is. So just if you look up here on the right, we're getting kind of an idea. It's about 600 miles west of Ecuador. It straddles the equator. It is made up of about 13 major islands and about 40 large rocks. Most of everything in the Galapagos that people see is in this central part. There are two little islands. You may have heard of these. They're not really by spatial orientation. They're not here. They're actually way off. It's like a couple days on a boat to get to these places. They're known more for not snorkeling, but for diving. I mean, you can snorkel there, but they're diving hotspots. It's where a lot of these great hammerhead photos come from. So what we're talking about is not so much these little outer islands here, but the central part of Galapagos. This is where all the magic happens. There's so much to love. One quick thing about itineraries for Galapagos out there, whether you've been or whether you're researching and going to Galapagos at some point on your bucket list or sometimes in the next couple of years, is you usually have different itineraries based on the operator on the boat you're going to go with. And oftentimes what you have is going to be a northern and western itinerary that kind of goes like in this general area and then over in this area, and then a central and southern itinerary, which kind of goes in this area. Both are fantastic. This is not the time to go over what you see and why certain itineraries are great. The really fascinating thing about Galapagos is even though every island has sort of its own unique assemblage of species, like you're not going to necessarily see every single tortoise species or subspecies on every one of the islands. Same thing with some of the birds, some of the iguanas, et cetera, but you get this really interesting kind of like doubling down effect of like let's say two different islands have the same species that you're trying to see. So coincidentally or not coincidentally, these itineraries are planned. So you're still going to see pretty much everything you could possibly want in the Galapagos. One just kind of gets to some of the more out of the way islands, and one kind of goes with shorter, quick motors, a little bit shorter trips in the interior. Nevertheless, you can't have a bad trip in the Galapagos Islands. You're going to see a little snippet of everything in the archipelago over the course of these photos here. So once again, we got about 13 major islands and a bunch of big rocks. They all have life. They all have really interesting imagery. They are all volcanic in origin. So it's basically a hotspot volcano chain of islands, archipelago, very, very similar to Hawaii. In fact, if you were to look at Galapagos Island side by side of Hawaii, they kind of have a similar look because it's like this dotted landscape on the map. And essentially, long story short, is you have this big hotspot of magma underneath the oceanic crust. Something caused it to bubble up and create volcanoes. And then as the tectonic plate, so the ocean crust, the world is moving, this plate is sliding actually into South America here, and subducting underneath it. So what's happening is the volcano is underneath the plate and it's moving and erupting, and the plate moves, erupts, plate moves steadily, like, a centimeter every 100 years. But nevertheless, so it moves over time. And of course, there are pulses of volcanic activity. So that's where you get this interesting, weird kind of splatter paint effect of the islands throughout the Galapagos. And same thing with Hawaii and a few other archipelagos around the world. So as a result, the islands are very volcanic in origin. This is one of the younger islands. This is on the west-hand side. So as you'll note, with that sliding the plates, all the islands in the east are the oldest, all the islands in the west are the youngest. In fact, this one, Fernandina Island, is still erupting. We often hear about recent eruptions. I think the most recent one was from just a couple of years ago, maybe even the same year. It's constantly going off, this volcano in the background and flowing into the sea. And I know we've actually had some groups be there and see it, and it's fantastic to see from a yacht on the water. It's nice and safe. So the landscapes range quite dramatically from these newer, very harsh volcanic lava fields all the way to some of the older islands where this volcanic deposition, sedimentation has sort of eroded through the ocean throughout the years, your tide pools. So it's just kind of a mix of everything. So the landscape is extremely dynamic. It is coastal, obviously, so there are plenty of beautiful black sand beaches and white sand beaches, everything in between, coral beaches. But the landscapes are a huge, huge bonus. And as you can see, my favorite type of wildlife photography, photographing wildlife in extraordinary landscapes, is really, really doable in the Galapagos. So another quick primer on why we're seeing what we're seeing in the Galapagos. Vegetation rafts. This is a concept that is so much easier to explain with a photo, because people may have heard of vegetation rafts and say, well, how exactly does a mat of vegetation turn into a raft exactly? But basically what happened is, as these islands started erupting, we're talking about 5 to 10 million years ago, so actually relatively recent in the grand history of the Earth. Gradually throughout monsoons and rains and hurricane seasons and all just normal life cycles of the Earth, you have big major South American rivers flowing into the ocean. The river near Guayaquil is a great example. A lot of groups go through Guayaquil before Galapagos, and they'll see the main riverway there, vegetation mats like this actually flowing out. Well, again, this is not necessarily a natural history presentation. We'll get to the photography next, but I want you to understand what happened is little tiny lizards and little tortoises and little things, all sorts of shapes and sizes, got stuck on mats of vegetation just like this, floated out to sea. They were kind of marooned. They survived for the days or weeks that it took to go 600 miles. They just got lucky and ran right into the Galapagos Islands. Not coincidentally, there is a major equatorial cross current that delivers all that water off the coast of South America right through the Galapagos. And so again, it's this perfect storm where life has found a way. These little lizards and iguanas, they hop off the vegetation raft. There's, again, the Noah's Ark hypothesis and theory is that there's a male and a female. They can obviously mate and reproduce. And long story short, you get normal looking tree iguanas that you might find near your jungle lodge in Ecuador that evolved over the course of a couple million years from this into this, a marine iguana. And there are a few other species as well like that. So anyway, very quick, I think, interesting primer about how the Galapagos got to be there. About 8 out of every 10 things you see in Galapagos is found nowhere else in the world. And really that 20% is only just the birds, because they can fly and they are migratory. Really anything that you see is relatively terrestrial. You're not seeing it anywhere else on the planet. Okay, so let's get into the photography aspect of things. We're talking about gear, the photo gear you need for Galapagos. Well, the great thing is that point and shoots, for those of you out there with point and shoot cameras like my trusty Canon here up in the upper left-hand corner, is really great for Galapagos. So don't think that you must go out and buy a big fancy camera. The great thing is you can be shooting, you can be photographing, something 10, 20, 30 feet away 1 second, zooming in to fill the frame of the face, and then shooting a landscape photo the next second of a beautiful tide pool beach or something like that, of a sunrise or a sunset. So the versatility of point and shoots are fantastic. In fact, if you do have a bigger, fancier camera and you also have a point and shoot, you may wish to bring both, because those that have more versatility will get more photos, plain and simple. But oftentimes, the higher quality cameras do indeed produce higher quality photos. But what I can say is some of the big merits of the much fancier cameras, of the incredibly fast shutter speeds, of the very low light sensitivity, they don't have quite as high of an advantage here as they might for, say, gorilla photography or lemur photography in Madagascar, where things are a bit more challenging. So the great news is as long as you are happy with the photos that come off your camera, you're going to be happy with photos from the Galapagos with the type of camera you currently have. Okay, so those that do have fancier cameras, let's kind of divert here for a second, talk about the go-to gear. So as you know, when it comes to wildlife photography, I stick with mainly my camera body in 2 lenses as my go-tos. Some sort of wide angle, like the 24-105, and then some sort of zoom telephoto. My personal preference is a very wide range, a 100-400. That means I have a lot of versatility. Keep in mind, this is the same setup I bring on an African safari, where I might have wildebeest way in the distance, or I'm photographing a cheetah sitting on a hill, a quarter mile away. So this is maybe a little bit overdoing the need for lenses. So as a result, and I often tell my photographers on Galapagos Islands trips, one of the best luxuries as an adept advanced photographer that has all this gear is you can swap out your big, heavy, fancy camera lens like your 100-400 for your 70-200 realm. And what that does, if you have this lens, these are the sharpest lenses out there. They have these great f2.8 ratings. If you know what it means to use primarily a 70-200 lens on a trip, that means you're out for an absolute tremendous photographic treat. So the rest of the gear that I'm going to bring with me, this is kind of like I want to fit these things. I might not for each and every trip, but let's quickly go through these. An ultra wide angle lens is fantastic. You can get these really unique perspectives of wildlife and beautiful skies, beautiful lava. So an ultra wide is great. If you have something in this range, that's fantastic. But something in like the 10-22 range is good as well. I never really leave home without my little tiny nifty 50 here. Never leave home without my smartphone. Smartphone is a great second camera body, because even if you have a point and shoot or a big fancy camera, you're going to see some great landscape shots. You're going to see some great traveler shots where half your group might be over here, 3 or 4 people, and a sea lion comes trotting down the beach. And it's just this amazing thing you want to photograph or take a video of. Smartphones are awesome for that. Macro. So this is my true X factor lens for a Galapagos Islands trip, and that's because you can get astonishingly close to a lot of the wildlife, like these little tiny lizards. Keep in mind in the Galapagos, these things having evolved no more than 5 or 10 million years ago, and they've evolved without any major predators on the islands, short of maybe the Galapagos hawk. They have no natural fear of humans. They have no natural fear of big, clumsy primates walking around the beaches in the sand. So they don't scurry off. So you'll get within feet of these beautiful lizards with amazing orange dewlaps and great coloration. Marine iguanas are quite literally everywhere. So you can actually bring a macro lens, but notice how I have a big red X over my macro flash. If you've tuned into one of my macro 101 or 102 webinars, you'll notice that the real way to do real good macro photography is to have a flash. The cool thing about Galapagos is it's so bright, there's often so much sunlight that you really don't have to have a flash. It's so different from a tropical jungle where I'm normally doing macro photography, or any sort of forest where it might be a little bit dimmer, darker conditions. Out in the full sun, you can use a macro. And the last thing, I use the brand name GoPro here, but really any sort of action camera. And this gets into the underwater photography and videography aspect of things. So that's a nice little way to get some pretty high quality underwater shots. We're going to go over a whole section of underwater photography here in a few slides. Okay, I'm going to blaze through this. Bring like 2 or 3 or 4 times more memory you think you're going to use. Plan on 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 shots a day. It's amazing how many photographic opportunities there are. You will never stop shooting photos of these bright red Sally Lightfoot crabs. I guarantee you, it'll be day 8. You're like, wow, I have 400 photos of these red crabs, and you'll see another one perched perfectly on a little lava rock, and you'll say, I got to have 10 more. And that's just going to happen. Bring a lot of memory. It's cheap. because these are boat-based trips and they have, you know, normal generators and whatnot, you can bring chargers, you can bring laptops. I think it's helpful to review photos afterwards. The last thing is tripod. Do you need a tripod at all? Do you need a full tripod? I will say yes, if you plan on doing any sort of videography. A lot of our cameras, whether it's point and shoot or big fancy ones today, they have really great video camera abilities built right in. And I'll say that the interactions and the behaviors of wildlife in the Galapagos is really, really fun to see. So it's not paramount. Also, you know, make sure you check regulations up to the minute because tripod rules do change often in very sensitive environments. The last I checked, tripods are totally cool to bring, but you know, think about that before you depart. They can be very, very helpful for videography. Other than that, you're gonna have a lot of light. You're not gonna really need to shoot on a tripod for what would traditionally be low light, slow shutter shots. You just don't need it. Okay, let's go into my techniques and tips for Galapagos. The first one, this is not necessarily a camera setting. This is not anything real fancy. It's all about perspective. What you'll find is most of the things you're photographing are low to the ground. They are terrestrial. If they are birds, they've lost the ability to fly within the millions of years of evolution, like the flightless cormorants. You have penguins down there. So they're, you know, we'll talk about birds in flight photography because there are some beautiful, magnificent birds that do fly. But the main thing is think about perspective. Think about getting down on your hands and knees, shooting at ground level. It's really, really important. It might be obvious, but it's a really important thing. Now is the time, if you're planning a Galapagos trip in the next year or so, to start doing your toe touches, start doing your stretches, start doing some balance activities, because you definitely want to get on plane with the wildlife. You don't want to just be constantly standing at full, you know, 5-6 feet tall and just aiming down and just getting top-down shots of stuff all the time. Because there aren't mountains really in the Galapagos, short of a handful of still active volcanoes. You're often photographing along shorelines, along paths, making sure you get down and get that perspective. It's way better shot than this, than that top-down approach. Another example here, animals that are in a lot of crevices, et cetera, et cetera. So macro techniques. Like I said, one thing I love about the Galapagos is how close you can get to the wildlife within all the regulations and safety precautions, and how close the wildlife will get to you often. So what a great opportunity this is to use a macro lens or macro techniques. If you have a true macro lens, that's fantastic. But I'm going to tell you some tips here that you may have picked up from previous macro webinars about if you just have a normal lens or a normal point and shoot camera, how you can get shots like this with all this amazing, amazing texture of marine iguanas and lava lizards and all sorts of cool stuff. So if you have a point and shoot, it's pretty easy. Just find this little button on your camera. Usually it's on the outside and the back. Sometimes it's in the camera menu. This is your macro mode. Also, if you have a more advanced point and shoot, remember that sometimes you can hold down that button for a couple seconds and it'll switch to super macro mode. It allows you to get even closer and make that image in your sensor and in your viewfinder even bigger. It basically makes a bigger photo. So that's your solution if you have a point and shoot. If you have a mirrorless or a DSLR, here's my my tried and true recipe for getting good macro shots. You're gonna get on manual. If you don't normally shoot in manual mode, that's fine. I don't really often either. I'm usually on aperture priority or something like that. But you are gonna get on manual mode and you're gonna set these things in your camera. Aperture is gonna be a big F number, like F8, F11, F16. Remember, you're getting a ton of light out there, so you can actually handle these wide depth of fields. Shutter of 1/200, and then I put my ISO on auto usually, and I let it choose. You're gonna find that it'll often give you a lower ISO than you think. But if you do need to program it in, not all cameras nowadays allow you to have ISO auto, something like 400-ish, maybe 800, maybe 200. And this is gonna give you this amazing, amazing texture. So once you have these settings, what you do then is you're gonna go ahead and zoom all the way in with your lens. So let's say you have an 18-55. You're gonna zoom all the way into 55 millimeters, and you're not gonna touch that. You're then gonna set your camera on manual focus. So remember, you just set your camera settings on manual, so you could dial in aperture and shutter speed and all that. But your manual focus is gonna allow you to set to the minimum focusing distance. So whether you have Canon or Nikon or Sony, all the lenses will allow you to manually focus, and you're gonna turn it in the direction of minimum focusing distance. And they usually have a little label on the lens as to which direction that is, clockwise or counterclockwise. Sets a minimum distance, and what you're gonna do, you are gonna be the focusing mechanism for your camera. So you're not gonna zoom in or zoom out, you're not gonna focus at all. Your camera is gonna be in full manual mode, and you are gonna physically approach this animal or this flower or whatever you want to practice on in the meantime until it becomes in focus. You're going to have your finger on that shutter ready to hit it and then fire as soon as the scene's in focus. And this gives you a true, what they call a one-to-one true macro photo. It makes the image the same size in the sensor as it is in real life in your viewfinder. So it's really, really cool stuff. Okay, so you're gonna see piles of animals at times. So like, check out this scene. This is such a classic Galapagos scene. Here's me from, gosh, I think this is 16 years ago. And piles of marine iguanas. We got sea lions in the back. We got groups walking on the, the lava safely, and it's just fantastic. So this is a cool shot, kind of like a picture me here sort of thing. This is what the shot would look like if I was standing there and shooting down from above. Remember, this is fine, it documents it, but it's not quite as artistic. It's not gonna be quite as mesmerizing of an image as it is if you get down low and you also try to show that depth. Showing all 100 marine iguanas or all 100 whatever you're seeing in an individual scene is fine. It kind of documents it. It's sort of like, wow. But as far as a really good quality photo, what I often advocate for when you do have this depth, when you do have a lot of animals, a lot of individuals, is setting on a very low f number if you're into that sort of thing, if you know how to set apertures, or if you're on a point and shoot camera or quite haven't gotten to the custom aperture settings, find this little logo for portrait settings. Okay, portrait maximizes that shallow depth of field. And what it does is, yeah, you can't count the number of marine iguanas like you could in this shot here, right? You can actually go through and count. They're all relatively in focus. But for this shot, it actually just shows like sort of the symbolism of this massive pile of iguanas, and the blurriness of the background actually helps isolate the subject, which happened to be smack dab in the middle of my scene. Remember, all rules are meant to be broken at times. And I think it shows a really interesting, more artistic shot than something that's more like documenting. Look around these piles, even though you might have the ability to photograph all 15 or 20 at a given time, look around for that portrait shot. Look around for one that's demonstrating something interesting behavior, laying on another, et cetera, and look for those individual shots, because there are so many that will come about. Showing that depth with that shallow depth of field is always important for wildlife photography. And it's very important for showing that layering of piles of animal photography, another type of photography I'll be getting into. Okay, so you are on a boat in the Galapagos. That's how 19 times out of 20 you're going to be in the Galapagos. There are a handful of people doing land-based trips, but most folks are doing boat-based trips, which is I would say one of the most sustainable ways to do it. You're going to see a lot of sunrises and sunsets. So here is my patented 3-step sunrise sunset process. It's the same technique whether it's rising or setting. Here we go. So we get a typical scene like this. We're going to start with the rule of thirds, okay? So we have this cool fishing boat. We've got some, it looks like maybe frigate birds soaring over. We've got a big sunset in the background. I have used my telephoto here because it gives me what's known as zoom compression. This boat's way far out in the distance. So that makes the sunset and that sky look really, really big. It fills the scene. But really what I'm starting with is a rule of thirds. So rather than putting things smack dab in the middle of the scene, I'm always going to start with this idea of breaking the thirds. You'll notice here, if I overlay my grid, I kind of have 2/3 of the sky and 1/3 of the ocean. You can flip it around, you can ignore the rule, and you can do your own thing. It's all good, but I usually start with the rule of thirds. Okay, so now I've kind of composed my shot. I see what the ultimate thing is going to be. The great way when you have a foreground object or subject in your scene, and I always advocate for big, impressive landscape scenes, to try to find something in the landscape to actually focus on. You can have the ability, and this is for most cameras out there, where you can focus and actually meter or get the exposure on 2 different parts of the scene. So if you're ever wondering what that little asterisk looks like, or not looks like, but what it is on the camera, it's usually somewhere up here in the right-hand corner of a lot of the fancier cameras. That's going to allow you to set your exposure. So the camera is going to choose how much light and dark to let in the scene. This is what allows you to bring out all these magnificent colors and textures of the sunset. So what you're going to do is you're going to do 2 different things here. You're going to hit the asterisk on something that's kind of in the middle, like what you really want to showcase, like that texture, that color. Focus around, or sorry, use the exposure around here, asterisk, and then use your focus to focus on the thing you actually want to focus on. Usually, if you're not using this technique, what you're going to be doing is when you focus, the camera will actually meter for you at the same time, so it'll be setting your exposure. The problem is if you use the metering on this boat, it would actually try to bring out all these shadows. It would think that you actually want this boat to be lighter. It wants to be at like a neutral kind of even amount of lighting, and that would what we call blow out the rest of the scene. So what it would do is it would increase the amount of light from the sunset and you would lose all these beautiful colors. You might have a little bit of pale yellow, but it mostly would be white. So using this button to separate exposure first and then focus second is great. Once you lock in that focus, you're gonna hold the shutter down halfway, you're gonna recompose with the rule of thirds, and you're gonna take the shot, okay? Because you are gonna be moving your camera around and the composition will change. So that's why I always set the composition first. I get it in my mind, I do the exposure, focus, recompose, take the shot. Works every time. And of course, you can certainly do so. One of the big things I'm advocating here is using zoom telephotos for sunset shots, especially big, impressive sunset shots. The most intuitive thing at the start is to get a huge photo. You know, use your ultra wide angle, use your cell phone, use something that's like wide angle, getting the whole scene, all the sky, all the ocean, and that's fine. But to get the most color and the most texture, use something with a bit of zoom, like a 70-200, like a 100-400, and really get in on that and fill the frame with those colors and textures. Because sometimes this might only be just that area around the sun. The rest is kind of like a drab white or yellow. And that's a great way to do it. And then I wanted to revisit this photo because, again, rules are always meant to be broken. I showed this at first. Look how I'm ignoring my own rule of thirds. You know, I'm bisecting this photo exactly 50-50. Isn't this exactly what I tell you not to do? Well, and this is why all rules are meant to be broken. Start with the rule of thirds, but if you find that the ocean is particularly beautiful with a reflection, if you find that it just looks really good for symmetry for whatever reason, then go for it. There's no reason to stick with the rule. Just start with it and know why you're breaking it if you are going to do it. Be able to justify it to yourself. Okay, the elephant in the room in Galapagos is the tortoise. These guys are magnificent. They're amazing. It's what most people think they're going to be seeing all day, every day in the Galapagos. They're like, oh yeah, Galapagos, there's just tortoises everywhere. I'm gonna have to step over them. Well, kind of. But really, they're only found in very specific areas you're going to be visiting. So you might only see tortoises a couple times on your 8-day trip. So you're going to want to maximize your photos of these guys. You're going to want to go into this day with a bit of a plan because it's what everybody's going to want to see. All your friends and family are going to want to see the giant tortoises after you get home. So first thing, incorporate scale. These guys are big. They're really, really big, and it's hard to understand, hard to showcase how big they are if you don't have some sort of frame of reference. Bushes and trees, those are great, but trying to get people in shots is actually really, really darn helpful. So there are, of course, regulations as to how far you need to be away. It's pretty generous. I think currently it's something like 6 feet or so, but sometimes they might walk right in front of your path, but getting a person in there for scale always helps to showcase the grandeur of these amazing, amazing tortoises. Filling the frame, this is another really big technique. So again, you might be thinking the whole time, I'm gonna get these big landscape shots, I wanna show the whole tortoise, I wanna make sure to get every little part of its carapace. No, break it into scenes. Now you're gonna probably remember this from a lot of my other talks, is that anytime you have big wildlife, anytime you really wanna showcase the splendor of an animal, break it into components. Don't just get the whole shot, get more than that. So one thing I'm doing here, I'm using my zoom telephoto, I'm filling the frame with its face. I'm filling the frame with its footbed and its nails. You know, there's just so many interesting things. When you're there and you're seeing these animals in person, it kind of goes away from you for a second that every little square inch of this animal is really different and really interesting and really photogenic. So just go in with a plan and think about that. And like I said, for the marine iguanas, make sure you're surveying the scene, you're moving around a bit. You're gonna see some really cool lineups of things. You're gonna see some really interesting leading lines, et cetera, et cetera. So don't always just go for the obvious shot. Get down, lower yourself, photographing into the scene, and move around and get different perspectives constantly. A bonus for photographing baby tortoises, which I know a lot of our groups get to see. At the Charles Darwin Research Center, they're actually breeding these little guys. This is almost the opposite. So oftentimes one way I will help kind of get, you know, if I'm at a tortoise breeding center in the research center of Galapagos, I don't really want the fences there. I don't really want, you know, some of the water corrals, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to zoom in, use that same technique to really zoom in, fill the frame with the animal so that it doesn't look like I'm in some sort of research center. For showcasing scale of these little cute baby tortoises that might only be like a year or two old, actually incorporating something that might be in their enclosures really helps, like this little water tray. Otherwise, it's kind of funny to say, but if you were just to photograph this guy without any sort of context, they look really quite similar to the adult giant tortoises. So getting something in there for some scale and some context is really darn helpful. Okay, moving on, underwater photography. And I have this actually as a question mark because you got to ask yourself, you know, do you really want to go down this route? Now, half of everything you're going to do in Galapagos is underwater, or at least 1/3. If you like snorkeling, you're going to be able to snorkel at least once every day, and the snorkeling is fantastic. It's some of the best snorkeling I've done in the world. Naturally, as a photographer, you're going to say, well, gosh, how can I not get some sort of rig to take photos like this? That would be great. Let me tell you, this type of photo with the lighting, with everything going on, the perspective, the type of lens, the type of underwater housing is very, very challenging. It's amazing how little light you get, even if you're just a couple feet under the surface. Most of the time when we get underwater rigs, even if they're kind of fancy, even if you pay hundreds of dollars to, encase your iPhone or encase your point and shoot or even your DSLR, most of your photos, no matter how much wildlife or how much brilliant colors you're seeing with your eyes, most of the photos your digital camera is going to capture is going to look like this. It's just going to be this weird kind of drab, very cloudy, nothing like what your eyes see because of the way the light interacts with the particles in the water. We call it backscatter with light and flashes. It doesn't really look as vibrant as you're hoping it. So the reason I'm saying that is underwater photography is something that I personally haven't gotten into a whole lot. And it's kind of my one time when I'm on adventures and on expeditions that I put the camera down. And I say, you know what? This is going to be just me floating through this watery wonderland, looking at stuff, and I'm not going to be worrying about getting photos every single time with every pretty fish that I see, with every interesting rock that I see, with everything that's out there. So that's just me. That's me personally, mainly because of how hard it is to get the great photos and really how expensive. So let's go back to that. The rig that got this photo, I don't know, this is not my photo. It could have easily been $15,000 worth of equipment that takes up 1.5 suitcases. We're talking about big strobe lights that are $1,000 a piece, massive underwater housings that are thousands of dollars. So anyway, this is just me being fully transparent about the rigors and challenges of underwater photography. It does exist, they are there. However, there are some cool things to document. I'm not saying you want to put the camera down for every magical experience underwater. This is why I say, not overthinking it, not having super high expectations of the underwater photography. The underwater experience, have as high of expectations as you want, because being down there is truly magical. But there really is a big disconnect between what you're experiencing, seeing, and loving, and then when you review your photos on your computer, at home or in your room on the ship, you're like, wow, I thought that was gonna be better. So what I often do is I'll bring a little GoPro. They're about the size of a pack of Tic Tacs. There are all sorts of little apparatuses that you can put onto your wrist or hold, and just kind of get some video, get some video of some of the sea turtles swimming around. Marine iguanas might be munching on algae underneath the water. There are some beautiful fish to be had. It's an opportunity. These things are not going to break the bank. They come water ready. They have great light sensors. They have great dome ports that help with that wide angle to actually compensate for the distortion of lenses underwater. They're like $400 or $500. You can use them for a bunch of other things. They're kind of my go-to recommendation if you do want to do anything underwater. This all being said, there's a really interesting number of new companies out there. If I were going to the Galapagos Islands tomorrow or next month, and I wanted to get some sort of rig for underwater photography, and I already had a GoPro, I'd be looking at these things. I just want to quickly plug this. I actually don't really know this brand very well, but you'll Google, underwater housings for smartphones with a dome port. And what this does, you might be thinking, why in the world do you have this spaceship saucer on the tip of your lens? Well, what this is it's a big bubble dome port, which puts the water at the minimum focusing distance of your lens. And this is what is needed to get, I'm sure you've seen these photos all over the internet. It's this very, very iconic, interesting photo that is kind of like the 50-50 shot of like getting a really beautiful shot of the land and the water and the underwater life all in one. And this is the rig you need to get shots like this. It's the only way to do it. You have to have that big bubble dome port in order to do it because you want to get that focus of the water's edge. Otherwise, it'll be very, very blurry. I would entertain this, again, not required whatsoever, but if I wanted to buy myself a new toy ahead of a Galapagos Islands trip, it would probably be that. And notice how it's got this really clever trigger. This is actually for a smartphone, it's just for your iPhone, which is gonna be great for underwater stuff. So anyway, food for thought. Okay, photographing out of a moving panga. So pangas are what they call Zodiacs down there, little rubber boats. What I do, the first thing I do is, the big question is, well, how do I protect my camera gear? It is salt water, it is the ocean. Fortunately, most of the little bays and inlets you're gonna be around are pretty still and pretty placid. If you do have any sort of current and bumping around, if it is windy, You may still go out, but more than that, what I do is I get something very basic to protect my camera. And these little dry bags from Sea to Summit, Sea Line is another one. We actually sell these in our NatHab gear store as well. They're like 10, 15 bucks. They're not too bad. Is I'll actually have one of them here. What I'll do is I'll have my camera strapped around my neck, and I'll actually take this bag. You'll see it's very lightweight. It opens, and I'll actually put this around my camera, and then there's a nice little clip here, and I'll just clip it like this, and that keeps it sturdy and steady, and it protects my camera. This is waterproof, and it keeps my camera very, very safe from salt spray or any sort of water. And with just a quick clip and a slide off, my camera is ready to photograph that blue-footed booby or that penguin or whatever you have out there. Technically, these things, to be watertight, you have to roll them like 3 times. So this is not watertight. If I drop my camera in the ocean, bye-bye, it's not good. But from spray, it protects it really well, because again, as it wraps around the camera, check this out, the seal is pretty closed. So I mean, it has to be like the perfect droplet or droplets of water to launch, get through that little opening, and happen to land on a part of my camera I don't want to land on. So that's my pro level tip for protecting your camera. The technique though, because you will be cruising on these Zodiacs, you know, at least once a day doing photography of the rock walls, of the marine wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. You know, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna recommend this is what you do to set your camera on before you leave your room, or right when you get in the Zodiac. The PANGA is get it on this. If you have a point and shoot camera, getting on sports mode is the quickest, easiest thing. Even fancier cameras allow you this shortcut, because what you're doing is you're trying to prioritize for a very fast shutter speed. I'm using at least 1/500th or 1,000th of a second, maybe even faster. What this does is any sort of movement, you know, if you're moving up and down, if you're moving left to right, and you only have a quick window to photograph this animal, or if the Zodiac and Panga is moving up and down, it allows you to freeze yourself with the photo, basically. So the actual image is frozen. Because you have a lot of sunlight, you don't have to worry. Your cameras can do this. You don't need anything super, super fancy or technical. And then get comfy if you are doing these more kind of manual settings, like a shutter speed priority mode, and actually dialing in 1/500th or 1,000th of a second. Get comfy with higher ISOs and knowing how to dial that in. And what that does is shots that if you have no experience with this, or if you have a point and shoot or an iPhone that might be blurry, using these simple tips will get you crisp shots like this blue-footed booby here on a nice rock ledge. And it'll get you shots that look like you have a tripod and you've been staging out this image for the whole day. It's really, really good stuff. Okay, next thing, managing harsh sunlight. So I talk about the sunlight a lot. Oftentimes we do have pretty open blue skies. Oftentimes we do have big top-down light. Now we like to prioritize our timing of the days to go out in the morning, go out in the evenings when the lighting is nice, but nevertheless, we will be spending time when we have big top-down light. What do you do? How do you manage for harsh sunlight? Well, one thing you can do is use it to your advantage. You can get really fast shutter speed. So when you have all that light, you can get all normal settings, but with really fast shutter speeds, and get these interesting scenes with like the salt spray and the sea foam, just like frozen in time, almost like a sculpture. Embrace the contrast. So the thing that we get from big top-down light is very contrasty scenes, very dark darks and very bright whites. Use that to your advantage. Look out for things that are naturally very dark and very light together. Throw in a nice red Sally Lightfoot crab, like I'm obsessed with photographing, and you get this really interesting artsy scene of the dark lava with high contrast, like a lot of shimmer, a lot of that white sea foam, and then this interesting red dot right in the smack dab middle. Look for scenes like dark animals on the dark lava. Embrace that high contrast. You can do that with one of these subspecies of marine iguanas. These are the juveniles. So embracing that harsh contrast and kind of creating dramatic dynamic scenes. Almost try to train your brain to think like, what would this look like as a black and white photo? This is not black and white. This is actually the true light colors shining through for that particular moment. But you can kind of see how Ansel Adams had a thing going on with these bright whites and these dark darks and creating this interesting sort of morph of a scene. The other thing you could do is use very wide depths of field. So when you have a lot of sunlight, the reason macro works so well without a flash in the Galapagos is that all that light allows you these very, very big F numbers, very, very big depths of field. Same thing, big F number, big depth of field. So you probably noticed from other webinars that I've done is that when you fill the frame with an animal, you want to try to get all appendages and all parts of that animal in a very similar focusing plane, meaning the whole thing is about the same distance from your lens. You don't want it at an angle. You don't want parts of it way behind or way in front. The great thing about that big depth of field is I can get most of all of these crazy legs of this crab in pretty darn good focus, because I can use that high level of sunlight to get a very, very wide depth of field. So using that sunlight, you can't put a cloud in front of it. You can't do anything. You can't bring a big shade cloth. So using it to your advantage, what does a lot of sunlight allow you to do? And these are those things. One thing you can do as a little bit of a mechanical hack is you can break your big scene into smaller components. So here we have a big scene, big bright light. You can tell coming from this angle, it's shining. We've got a lot of dark shadows. We get a lot of light sand. You know, kind of this is your classic sort of harsh, contrasty scene. You know, it's an interesting thing because we got a marine iguana with a little lava lizard on top. But if we just use our telephoto zoom and break the scene into a smaller component, it minimizes the harshness of all those bright spots and shadows and breaks it into a little bit more of like a sectional or a divided scene of like, okay, this is the dark part, this is the light part, rather than dark, light, and just sort of like a modeled sort of Swiss cheese looking scene that frankly is just kind of distracting for the eye. All rules are meant to be broken. It's ultimately up to your preference, but normally a scene like this with modeled bright and dark spots, it's a little bit distracting to actually focus in on what the photographer is trying to get you to look at, and it's a scene like this. Polarizer. So it's one of the few trips where I do make sure I have a polarizer in my bag. There are some great tide pools to comb and look around. This little shark here in one of the tide pools. What a polarizer does is it minimizes glare from the top of water. That's like the most effective thing it does. It does some ancillary things like help clouds pop and darken and saturate some of the blues, but its primary focus, the reason we try to get polarized lenses in our sunglasses, is it reduces glare. So having that for tide pooling, having it for what we call marine observation of sea turtles bopping up and down, it allows you to get a little bit deeper into that water with nothing more than a polarizer. Otherwise, you're gonna get a lot of shimmery light on top of it. So polarizer is quite fun. Okay, as we're nearing the end of the presentation, I wanted to wrap up with a technique here, birds in flight. So let me put it this way. It's not that the birds that are flying in the Galapagos make for the absolute best photos in the world. I mean, this is a cool shot. I like it. I'm happy with it, but it's not, you know, this isn't like my most prized shot of a bird anywhere. What it does give you though is the ability to practice so much about birds in flight, because you will always have a bird soaring above your yacht. You will always see birds flying here and there. So I want to give you my 2 techniques for photographing birds in flight, because the Galapagos, not only are, you know, you can absolutely get birds in flight, but it's a great time to practice as well. Use this for your own backyard if you'd like. Okay, so option 1, we've got a great frigate bird here, male with that red gullard pouch, kind of a beautiful shot. I'll be honest, it's not in perfect focus. It's okay. These are just tutorials and examples. What we're gonna do, we're gonna first set our camera on center point autofocus. So what that means is that you're not gonna let the camera choose which part of the frame to have the autofocus. It's always gonna focus in the dead middle of the frame, okay? So center point autofocus. We're then gonna put on aperture priority. We're gonna go for f8 and ISO 800. So these are all settings you just dial in, trust in the system, and you're gonna get great results. The reason for that f8, the reason for that wider depth of field is because if you do miss it, if you do focus on something not quite in the middle of the body of the animal, that wider depth of field is gonna compensate and give a little bit more focus, and I'm pretty sure that's what I did here. Track a bird, and this is an interesting thing. If you have image stabilization or vibration reduction in your lenses, and you've ever wondered what that 1 and 2 means, you'll often see it's a little slider, a little button. You can be on 1 or 2. What 2 does is it's perfectly suited for birds in flight. So when a normal image stabilization is going on, it's adjusting for top down and left right movement. So it basically is covering 360 degrees. If you're moving like this with your hands, it's gonna stabilize that. If you're moving anything like that, what mode 2 does is it only stabilizes for the up and down movement, and it will not stabilize for the lateral side to side movement. And it's really good for tracking birds for bird photography, because as you're tracking them across the sky, the stabilizer isn't constantly trying to adjust left to right. Try it. Try keeping it on mode 1, and as you track it across the sky, it's gonna constantly just kind of jerk and just move a little bit. Mode 2 turns that off. It allows you to track, stabilized, great. Then autofocus and shoot, okay? That's a great technique for some people. A lot of people prefer this technique. What it's known as is either servo for Canon folks or AFC focus or continuous focus for Nikon folks. You can set your camera in this, and what this allows it to do is as you hold that shutter down, anything that is in that autofocus zone is continually autofocusing. So Nikon has a little bit better terminology in my opinion. I am a Canon guy, but the continuous autofocus says what it is. Servo is just the lingo we've learned as Canon users. So either one, set it on that. Then, very contrary to the previous one, instead of having a center point autofocus the whole time, you're actually going to give a full screen autofocus. And this is usually just a button you're going to toggle through, look in your camera's manual, check out some videos on YouTube. Full screen autofocus allows the camera to choose where that autofocus point is. I generally hate that setting. Birds in flight, it's fantastic because you're usually photographing against a very uniform, bright sky with a very, very prominent foreground subject, and the autofocus is going to work quite well. Okay, so as you use your autofocus and let the camera decide the point, it'll pick up the bird, and as you hold that shutter down, it'll continually focus as either you move in the PANGA or the bird moves from left to right, forward to back, and it's going to give you really, really good results. Same settings as before. If you want to have a little bit wider depth of field, it's quite helpful. You might want to zoom out and track the bird rather than zooming all the way in, plan to crop after the fact. Autofocus and shoot. So the main reason I'm telling you this is a great technique to practice in your backyard. If you're headed to a state park or a national park here this fall, it's a great time to practice. It is rewarding. I still do like it for the Galapagos quite a bit, but honestly, with the way things have evolved in Galapagos, so many of the most interesting birds are flightless. I actually prefer to focus and prioritize those birds that haven't quite yet left the ground, which I think are quite a bit more interesting. So nevertheless, that wraps up our presentation. Quick plug for our nature tutorial photo website and natural habitat, thenaturalphotographer.org. Check this out, bookmark it. New articles are coming constantly, and lots of static content, drop-down menus here about all things nature and wildlife photography that exist there all the time. Take a look, and I think now's the time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Court. Before we get to the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone watching that you can submit questions for Court in the control panel under the questions field. Okay, one of the big questions is, when is the best time to go?
Great question. Galapagos, I'm so happy to say, is one of the very few truly year-round destinations. So here's the deal, is that Galapagos is right over the equator. You would think it has a traditional rainier cycle. There is no such thing as the dry season in the tropics, but it actually is. It is quite dry. You'll notice the landscapes I've been showing you are dry and craggy. It has everything to do with these big ocean currents, and I probably should have thrown a slide up here, but if you want to know more about that, just Google ocean currents around Galapagos, and there are 3 major ones, and they act as kind of like an air conditioning unit for the Galapagos. So there's not a strong seasonality. Because there's not a lot of seasonality, things are being born and things are happening year round. That all being said, there is a slight rainier season. It's known as the Garua season, G-A-R-U-A, means like a fog. There's a little bit of a thicker fog in their brief kind of summertime, which is technically from January to March. Things do green up a little bit. Things get a little bit warmer. Sometimes you have a little bit of a fog and a mist in the early mornings and late evenings. I think that's great for photography, so I don't look at it as a negative whatsoever, but really it's quite year round. I love every single season of the Galapagos. I honestly say it's one of the few destinations where I say go around your schedule, and then the wildlife and scenes will be there. I do note that Galapagos happens to be quite popular around like the holidays, like Christmas time, like Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. It's a great time to visit there. The temperatures are perfect. It's kind of like an eternal springtime. That cool ocean water that surrounds the archipelago buffers the equatorial sun, and it's a really nice, like, highs in the mid 70s to low 80s, lows in the high 50s, mid 60s. It's really quite cool.
Great. And some more Galapagos related questions. Do they limit the number of folks ashore at any given time?
Yes, yeah, Galapagos is highly regulated. I don't know what the current total boat count and total visitor count is like per year, but it's highly regulated. It's one of the best examples of true ecotourism out there. I've used it as case studies for many papers and studies. That's a big part of the story, and I haven't really told any of that here. The one key regulation is you have to have at least one Galapagos naturalist guide for every 16 people. So that is a regulation. So you can't have more than 16 people with that guide. They stagger the landing times. Your permit system is very much based on what island you're at what time. You do have time windows. The great thing is the guides, they don't make it seem like anything's on a real harsh clock. It is island time, but it's all that orchestration, it's all that planning and logistics of the tour operators like us that make it seem like a very relaxing time. But we do have very, very strict, because they don't want you bumping into other groups. They want to maintain that adventurous nature. They want to maintain good sustainability. I will say, even though there's that 16:1 guide to guest, guest to guide ratio, one thing I'm very proud of that NatHab does is it's actually 2:1, or 2 guides for every 16 people. So we actually have a ratio of about 8 guests for every guide. And I think that makes all the difference, not just for sustainability, but what you're gonna learn, what you're gonna do, where you can physically be on the islands. It's a good thing.
Absolutely. And there are a few folks who are curious about the wildlife on the islands and if they're ever dangerous or bite.
Well, so you don't want to get so close that they're wanting to bite you. I'll put it that way. No, a short answer, no, nothing is dangerous. Remember, they have not evolved with humans, and just the last few decades of ecotourism happening is not enough for these behaviors to have evolved with newer generations. So no, like the little lava lizards that are about this big, they're not going to go after you. They're not going to bite. The marine iguanas, they eat algae, so as tasty as you might look, they're not going to nip your fingers. I mean, there are certain regulations for how close you can get to some of the bigger things. You know, these are Galapagos sea lions, so it's a different species technically than the California or other sea lions in the area. You know, those are the things you don't necessarily want to get right in the face of a sea lion. But for the bigger stuff, you know, you have to be at least, I think, 6 feet away from some of the bigger mammals, some of the bigger reptiles. So that's where having a little bit of telephoto power for the photography is great. But no, nothing is dangerous, I would say.
Great. And are you aware of any weight restrictions, or do you have recommendations for photo gear to bring? And are backpacks okay?
Yeah, so when you go to land each day, there's a certain regulation. You can bring a backpack. You just can't bring any food on the islands. So no trail bars, no snacks. What they're really worried about is, you know, a candy bar dropping out and the marine iguanas changing over from algae to Snickers. They're delicious. But no, mainly it's because like if a seed or a nut falls out and plants a tree, like that really harms the ecosystem. They're quite protective. The flight from mainland Ecuador to Galapagos has normal international flight regulations. So I think, you know, 1 or 2 50-pound bags, normal carry-on size. It's actually pretty normal. When you book a trip, whether it's with us or with another group, they will give you very specific regulations, but it's very typical regulations. So no, I bring a lot of stuff. I bring a lot of camera gear. I bring my normal, you know, stuff for suitcases, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing we recommend, it's just helpful if you do bring a soft-sided duffel, because once you unpack in your cabin, you can roll that duffel up, put it underneath the bed or toss it somewhere, and it's not a big hard-sided suitcase somewhere. That's the only real advice, more than a recommendation. So yeah, camera gear, you can bring a hefty amount. It's not like little bush planes in Africa or Papua New Guinea or places where you're very limited. It's another nicety.
Okay. I will move on to some questions about shooting tips. Should one practice shooting without using the viewfinder when shooting with a camera near the ground?
Oh, that's a good question. So I love cameras nowadays that have the movable viewfinder that actually allows you to tilt it. It's still a minority of cameras that allow that. Even the bigger, fancier cameras don't have it, but it's a huge bonus if it does. So if you're in the market for a new camera and you're primarily getting it for Galapagos and then some, look for that movable LCD. No, and you know, I don't want to stress that it has to be on plane with like terra firma. Like you don't have to be millimeters or inches above the ground. It's more, you know, rather than standing at your normal height of 4 or 5, 6 feet, you know, make sure that you're at least getting down to like two feet or so, and just, you know, minimizing that angle, getting a little bit more acute rather than just coming down and shooting. That all being said, you can certainly practice. It's quite difficult if you can't see the viewfinder. What I would do instead is turn your LCD viewfinder on, and maybe as you're on the ground, you know, maybe on your haunches or on your knees, just putting out in front of you. And like this, you should be able to see well enough, even if it's below you, at what's going on the LCD screen. It's not so much for composition. You can always crop after the fact on your computer. It's more to make sure you're focusing on the right thing, because what you don't want to do is have this amazing scene of, you know, something beautiful like kissing sea lions or whatever, and focus on the sand, and then everything else is blurry. And that happens a lot if you just blind shoot and blind focus. So developing a little bit of a system, I think is advisable. I wouldn't just totally blind shoot, but there are plenty of workarounds.
And this is a question about your 3-step process on sunsets. Can you explain
Yes.
more about refocusing the image? What are you refocusing on as the last step after separating exposure and focus?
Great, absolutely. So my preference, and you don't always get this with photography, my preference is to photograph a sunset with something in the foreground, meaning like in the Galapagos, there are boats. There might be fishing boats, there might be another ecotourism yacht. I think that provides a lot of scale and context. So that's gonna be my focus point. You want that in tack sharp focus, even if it's just silhouetted, you want that in focus. If you don't have a foreground element, you can actually kind of skip that more complicated second step where you're splitting the exposure and the focus. If you don't have a foreground element, you can actually just focus on the clouds, focus on something that has a high contrast, high texture, focus on that color that you want to express, and skip that asterisk step. You can actually just focus and meter on the same dot. The only challenge is if you do that and have a foreground element that's closer to you, that boat or that dock or that person is going to be out of focus, and it's going to be noticeable, and you're not going to like it.
All right, let's move on to some gear questions. Someone's considering getting a GoPro 8 for their trip to the Galapagos next year. Are they good for underwater photography?
Yeah, they are. I mean, you know, every generation they come out with gets more and more impressive. I think the latest ones, in terms of like, you know, why that's better than the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. They're getting better with image stabilization in there, which is really nice. It's nice for especially the viewers of your videos because it's not too choppy and too movie. Yeah, I think it's a perfect thing to do. If you use your GoPro to its maximum potential, is well worth the investment. It's particularly good for underwater photography and videography. If you use it for nothing else but that, it's still a good investment. Yeah, 2 thumbs up.
And can you remind us of your favorite point and shoot camera again?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your budget. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of things you get what you pay for. There's really 2. If you're looking for something in sort of the intro but still sophisticated range at about $500, it's the Canon PowerShot series. I think they're up to the HS70 SX. It's a lot of letters, but it's the HS70 SX Canon PowerShot point and shoot. Again, about $500. The thing that's making big waves across the camera industry right now is a new class of camera known as a bridge like you drive over. And it's technically a point and shoot because you don't remove the lenses. But it's very, very advanced, and it has basically the same sensor as you have in better SLR and mirrorless cameras. And my favorite on that is the Sony RX10, and they're up to the version 4 now. So Sony RX, X is an X-ray 10 version 4. It's going to run you significantly more, about 3 times as much, like 1500, but it's going to give you much better quality. It's got a 600mm lens built right into it. So that camera is going to be a point and shoot, but it's going to be for the person that may want to spring for the DSLR, may want to spring for the mirrorless, but isn't sure if they want to deal with changing lenses. And I can tell you that Sony camera is phenomenal.
And do you ever use a teleconverter?
I've been known to. I think it's a great thing, especially with the 70 to 200. It might be a good idea for the Galapagos if you don't have anything bigger than the 70 to 200, yet you want to have a little bit more reach. So here's what I've noticed with teleconverters is that you have to have a really sharp lens to put it on. So as far as zoom lenses go, you can't really put it on anything but a 70 to 200. They're really designed for your big primes, your 300mm, 400, 500, 600 primes, like your African safari lenses. Anything less than that, and it's not sharp enough, it's going to degrade the quality. So here's what I've noticed about putting a teleextender on a 70 to 200 is that basically I get the same quality shot if I put the converter on, take the shot, get closer to the animal, and review that same photo with a photo I took without the teleconverter and just cropped in on the computer on the photo, side by side, they're the same quality. So if you don't need a certain amount of megapixels, so with the converter, it preserves the amount of megapixels because you're not cropping. So it's got all the megapixels. But if you don't need all 45 megapixels, if you're not printing off for like ad agencies, billboards, stock photography, stuff like that, I think it's a step you don't really need to take. And plus, it also, remember, it drops your f-stop ability by 1 or 2 stops. Like if you have a 1.4 teleconverter, that means that your brilliant lens that's an f2.8 becomes an f4. If you have a 2 times teleextender, it turns into an f5.6, and you're losing a lot of the sophistication and a lot of that prowess of such a wonderful lens. So they could be applicable, but I generally opt not.
Okay. And last question for today, are drones allowed?
No, definitely not. I could, yeah, so drones are not allowed in a lot of places these days. It would be so cool, trust me, it would be so amazing. You know, one good question is like if they're allowed over your boat, you know, if you're like way in the middle of the ocean. I'm sure they're not, because the Galapagos Marine Reserve is actually well beyond the islands. They're not going to want to deal with that. They're not going to want to deal with drones flying into birds. When I say they, I mean like Galapagos National Park officials. So no, unfortunately, it would be really cool. It would be fascinating, but can you imagine the hundreds of thousands, or you know, thousands of people a year using drones? There's going to be some mishap.
All right. Well, it is the top of the hour, Court, so I'm going to hand it back over to you for some closing comments.
Yeah, great. Well, Galapagos, it's a wonderland for photography. For those that are just starting, for those that are pro level, it's really a fun place. Get there sooner than later. It's absolutely amazing for all reasons. And like I said, you know, these are crazy times for travel, but things are steadily opening up if you have that tolerance to travel now. I noticed that actually over the holiday season, Ecuador is kind of promoting some travel to the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos, it's kind of a great way to get away from it all. So yeah, if you're keen and apt to travel sooner than later, check us out, ask questions, see what you can do, travel over the holidays. It's a beautiful time to go. But otherwise, I'd love to see you out there. I hope you get there at some point, and hope you have a lovely Tuesday.
Great. Thank you, Court. Fabulous tips as always. I appreciate your time today. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay link available soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.